This is the Dark Zero Horror Network. Psychological Autopsies.
Welcome to the debate. Tonight we are examining the very controversial and I think very complex legacy of the early 90s cult series Forever Knight. It's centered on Nicholas Knight, a 700-year-old former vampire working to, well, atone for his sins as a homicide detective in modern-day Toronto.
And for fans, that show, it represented this ultimate dramatic possibility, right? A quest for absolution against this impossible backdrop of immortality and an eternal guilt. But the show's narrative promise was, let's be honest, critically derailed. First by structural issues in its final season, and then by the deeply polarizing and just fatalistic series finale last night.
Yeah, the ending wasn't just bleak. It felt like a mass repudiation of the show's central themes.
Exactly. And that mass repudiation is precisely where we find our controversy tonight. That finale inspired such a widespread, almost furious rejection that it inadvertently spawned an entire subgenre of fan creation online, all devoted solely to fixing the ending. The wounds from that conclusion remain raw even decades later.
Which, leads us directly to our core question. Should the Forever Knight franchise be formally revived, either through a sequel, a continuation, or maybe a full reboot, specifically to address that disastrous ending and finally deliver the redemption arc the story was always meant to pursue? I'm going to argue that a new iteration isn't just viable, but strategically necessary to redeem the original concept's untapped potential.
And I approach this, a bit differently. I'm going to argue that attempting a formal revival actually risks undermining the unique, the dynamic, and frankly, the intellectually rich legacy that was already created by the fans' own sophisticated revisionist theories. They invested the time, the creative energy to provide their own closure. So why risk invalidating that deep personal connection with an official, and let's face it, likely disappointing canonical fix?
Okay, I see why you value the fan legacy. I really do. But let me offer a different perspective here on why this narrative it demands a formal revival. The original series was fundamentally hampered by this constant network instability. It kept moving homes and, with each move came these mandated changes. Just consider the forced structural shift in Season 3, right, where network pressure inserted that whole secondary and, frankly, less compelling vampire-human romance between Tracy and Javier. This constant outside interference, it really prevented the show from ever fully realizing its potential. So the failure, I'd argue, was structural, not solely creative.
I'll agree that outside pressure was a huge factor, but framing the failure solely as network interference, I think that overlooks a deeper problem of internal quality control it marred Season 3. Even granting the structural compromises, the creative team systematically killed off the entire supporting cast, most painfully Nick's indispensable partner, Shanke, in what felt like a deliberate act of creative self-destruction. And let's not forget the storylines that strayed into the ridiculous. The infamous vampire dog episode. Furthermore, the handling of Natalie Lambert's character, who shifted from a determined, empathetic coroner to what many fans accurately perceived as an unbearable bitch, that just demonstrated a deep creative exhaustion.
Well, regardless of those third-season flaws, the core dramatic possibilities, they remain powerfully simple. You have the detective procedural twist, the complex Nicholas-Natalie-Jeanette love triangle, and of course the ultimate, foundational parent-child conflict between Nicholas and his sire, LaCroix. A modern version could leverage the current success of, sophisticated horror dramas and finally deepen the show's most compelling conceptual framework, the vampire as a dict trope.
That is a compelling concept, but it was really just hinted at, never fully explored.
Exactly. Imagine a backstory where, in a moment of pure weakness, Nick fed upon Natalie. Just imagine that. It creates an irreversible codependent tension.
The relationship becomes one of an addict and a caregiver who might secretly share the same compulsion, or one where the caregiver has become a secondary source of the addiction. It's like a heroin addict and an alcoholic trying to help each other out, bound by their shared darkness. Now that is rich, emotionally complicated drama that a modern reboot, free from 90s television constraints, could finally explore and use to drive the story of redemption.
But the ending we received, as destructive as it was, it achieved a unique kind of integrity, precisely because it provoked that mass rejection. That rejection is now the bedrock of the show's intellectual legacy. And trying to produce a sequel or continuation now is also just practically difficult. I mean, it's been over 20 years. It is extremely difficult for actors who have visibly aged to convincingly play immortal characters who have to retain that ageless quality. But the biggest risk is intellectual. Formalizing one single canonical ending risks invalidating the rich alternative scenarios the fans have poured their lives into developing. We have the mercy of lacrosse theory, that lacrosse missed the staking deliberately. We have the mortal Nick loophole, where he survived but lost his immortality. And critically, we have the theory of Natalie's accidental crossing, turning her into a fledgling vampire. These revisionist ideas are the story's true continuation.
We have to focus on the pivotal moment last night. It was widely seen as a downer, potentially conceived by the creator, James Perriott, as an attempt at, well, revenge on the network for canceling the show. But Perriott himself stated publicly that we never actually saw lacrosse bring the stake down. This is crucial. It implies the ending was conceived as ambiguous, specifically leaving the door open for a sequel, TV movie, or a follow-up that could bring the intended sense of hope and absolution back into the narrative.
I find that line of reasoning compelling, but ultimately it's irrelevant to the audience experience. The ambiguity only exists for those seeking a loophole after the fact. The ending that aired was experienced by the audience as definitive and destructive. I mean, Nick kneels over a dying Natalie, hands LaCroix the stake, and we cut to black with the sound of LaCroix growling, "Damn you, Nicholas," and the rising sun. A formal revival years later would just destroy the unique fan-driven alternate realities that have been sustained for 2 decades by forcing one single canonical outcome. It would effectively rob the fandom of their hard-earned intellectual investment in that uncertainty.
But those fan theories, they actually demonstrate the tremendous narrative potential that a revival could harness. You brought up the dark Nick and Nat pack, who were the fraction of the fan base that actually supported Natalie being turned or crossed into a vampire. Or the theories about Jeanette's return to curb a grieving LaCroix. New showrunners wouldn't have to invent plot. They could expand on barely touched upon ideas that the original show just left dangling, like the shadowy enforcers or the organization.
Wait, why introduce complex political lore now?
To provide a richer, more contemporary vampire society. Look at the success of shows like True Blood or Sherlock. Audiences today expect complex world building. Integrating those concepts could offer a global context for Nick's struggle, moving beyond his singular internal guilt to show that he's fighting a larger war. This shift could finally deliver the sense of scale and redemption that Season 3 completely abandoned.
I respect the idea of expanding the lore. I do, but I worry that moving from a focus on internal guilt, the personal battle for Nick's soul, to external threats like the enforcers, it just fundamentally alters the show's DNA. The core appeal of Forever Night wasn't its mythology. It was the poignant tragedy of one man's internal moral reckoning. Furthermore, if you're rebooting, you risk alienating the original audience if the characterizations are off. I mean, have you considered the integrity of the existing characters?
That's a fair point. The show was often inconsistent in its character development.
Exactly. Take Jeanette Ducharme. She was initially the one stable, strong, ancient vampire counterpoint to Nick's spiritual instability. She represented the power and acceptance of immortality. Yet, in her final arc in The Human Factor, she was fundamentally changed. She turned mortal due to grief, was shot, and became this vulnerable woman needing protection. Many fans found this destruction of her character to be cruel and just fundamentally against the established identity she represented. A new cast or a new framework might similarly mismanage the core personalities that made the show so compelling in the first place.
I would argue, though, that a reboot allows for significant improvement and expansion on those very concepts that were underdeveloped or poorly handled. The character Urs, for example, who was written as this contradictory combination of appearing naive and childlike, yet possessing an ancient, deep wisdom. She was fascinating but criminally underutilized. A new series could bring her back, perhaps making Urs Nick's own progeny, creating a new, intense love-hate conflict that immediately echoes the dynamic he shares with Lacroix. This would deepen the thematic structure instantly.
That assumes you can capture that strange, fragile ambiguity that made Urs so interesting. And what about Jeanette? If she was mishandled, how does a reboot fix it?
Well, a revival provides the opportunity for narrative redemption. It could formally resolve the intentional ambiguity surrounding Jeanette's final fate in the human factor. While the episode left it equivocal, the final scene, where Nick is called to the Civic Center and finds the arsonists killed by a vampire, led to a really powerful fan interpretation. The majority view was that Jeanette survived and became the Avenger, returning to her nature.
And you think forcing that specific fan interpretation into canon is a positive?
Yes. A revival could formally integrate that fan theory, clarifying that she became the vampire who killed the arsonists and offering a powerful, definitive, and satisfying ending for a major character who, well, deserved better than an ambiguous demise. It's a way to retroactively reward the audience's intelligent engagement with the text.
Forced clarity is superior to sustained ambiguity. The show's strength at its best lay in its unresolved mysteries. That final police analysis of the Civic Center evidence stated that, quote, no certainty can be found either way. That demonstrates the show's deliberate choice to leave things open-ended. Modernizing or simplifying these mysteries for a new audience risks losing the very intellectual nuance that engaged the original sophisticated fan base. The ambiguity forced the fans to become co-creators of the narrative, and that unique process is what we should be defending.
But when the show's creative team failed to commit to a satisfying resolution, whether it was Jeanette's fate or Nick's ultimate goal, it left the narrative feeling incomplete and, well, betrayed. That failure of execution is precisely why a new effort is needed. The original show was critically hampered by external forces and concluded with a poor, intentional downer that betrayed the central themes of hope and redemption.
And I believe that the controversy of the finale actually led to a unique, highly passionate fan legacy that already provided its own revisionist resolutions. The fans built the extended universe out of narrative necessity. Attempting a canonical fix now, decades later, it risks being too late. Many of the original key players would be difficult to secure, and the attempt could destroy the unique, messy value of the original ending that birthed such extensive intellectual engagement in the first place. Sometimes the most powerful legacy is the one the audience creates themselves.
Redemption may be slow, but I don't think it's ever too late for a story to find its true ending. The material is just too rich to be left defined by its lowest point.
And sometimes the questions raised by a complex, incomplete narrative are ultimately more compelling than any definitive answer a sequel could provide. We risk trading enduring philosophical tension for ephemeral fan service. Regardless of whether Nicholas Knight's struggle is continued through a formal revival or sustained through the incredible creative activity of the fan base, the central themes of sin, guilt, and the search for ultimate redemption, they continue to resonate and inspire. The passion is just undeniable.
It's clear this material retains its unique bite, and we really have the fandom to thank for keeping that legacy alive.
Thank you for joining us on this deep exploration of controversy and legacy. We appreciate the audience of the Dark Zero Horror Network for tuning in.
And if you enjoyed this intellectual dive into controversial horror legacies, be sure to like and subscribe for future episodes of The Debate. Good night.